15 and 15.
Okay, well, I was 15 when the war began and the World War II began. So just imagine yourselves, Mrs. Norman told me that she's already told you about the way the Germans went on and attacked Poland and so forth, and then the French people knew that, our turn would be next. It wouldn't be long before they invaded France. So just imagine yourselves, you're on vacation at your grandparents, and you're 15 years old, and all of a sudden somebody says there's going to be a war. Your daddy's probably going to have to go fight. If you have big brothers or uncles, they're going to have to go fight. I mean, it's not a very pleasant thing to think about, but that's exactly what happened on September 3rd of 1939. France and England declared war on Germany. The reason we declared war on them is because we all knew our countries were threatened. And, that was one way, I guess, take the offensive maybe it's better than wait until they're already there. So anyway, we were in Strasbourg, our family was, with my grandparents, and we have to go home. We have to go home to Paris where we live. Because we didn't know if Daddy would have to go to war or if at least he was needed at work. And school starts in October in France, so October. So we had to go get ready to go back to school. So here we go. Really, it doesn't seem much like war yet. When we got to Paris, nothing had changed an awful lot, but then soon, pretty soon, rumors began to come that the Germans were nearing the French border, that they would eventually, reach Paris, and by that time it was nearly panic. Women and children were evacuated. They had to leave the big cities. They thought, well, the big cities is where the planes are going to throw the most bombs, drop the most bombs, and that's where it would be most dangerous. So here we're herded on trains, almost like cattle, I guess. We were just long lines of women and children had to go on trains. We had no idea where we were going. My family wound up on the west coast of France, on the Atlantic coast, in a little village, and the people there were good. They had opened their homes and their schools, and were willing to receive refugees. You've heard the word refugees. Well, we were refugees. So we started school there, and classes were like 200 people to a class, maybe, because they were coming from all over. So they learned an awful lot. We didn't have any clothes with us because we were just allowed one little bitty bag each, just the very necessities. So they started a place in the school where they had people that donated clothes, and you went digging through the pile to see if you could find a pair of shoes that fit you. This was the beach. We needed different kind of clothes than we'd had in Paris anyway. But somehow we survived that. They gave us food. The Red Cross helped us to stay in touch with our husbands, with the husbands, with our fathers, or the rest of the family. In the meanwhile, my daddy had to go to southern France also because he worked for a factory where they make Renault automobiles. And they knew that the Germans would eventually take over the factory and, make them build war materials. And so they moved the major part of the factory to southern France, and Daddy had to go with them. So we stayed in the little village about 3 months. Then my mother got very sick, and we decided we'd be better off at home. So we went back to Paris. And then again, the Germans were getting closer to Paris, and people were afraid. Everybody was afraid. But Daddy came back on a visit, and he said, I think you'd be better off staying here. In the meantime, the government had urged everybody, that was not actually taking part in any, important work in Paris and so, to just get out. Well, by that time there weren't any trains left because they were carrying ammunition for the Germans. There was no gasoline for the cars. People took their bicycles, their wheelbarrows, their baby buggies, and just piled them full of clothes and food, whatever they had bought ahead of time. Maybe they had a little food. They knew things were going to be hard. So. And it was an exodus, just like, I guess, like the people left Egypt and just with nothing practically. And I'm glad we didn't go because we heard reports later. It was at that time the Italians decided to declare war on France. we've always accused them if they waited to see who was going to win the war before they made up their mind what side they were going to be on. Well, I think it's true. Anyway, while those here, there are just thousands upon thousands of women and children pushing baby buggies and bicycles and old folks. And the Italians get their planes and just swoop down low over the people and machine gun. I still get emotional when I think about it. But that's war. Even some of the French people weren't exactly the best neighbors or the best friends. Naturally, all those people stopped at farmhouses, tried to get food and water. And I understand that some of the French people even charged them for a glass of water. That part was very, very, very bad. Then the Germans eventually did reach Paris. They just took over the town. They just took the best hotels and then just took them over and lived in them. A lot of Jewish people who had a little bit of money, or some of them a lot of money, I guess, had left Paris before when the war actually began. They knew it was coming. They knew what the Germans were doing to the Jewish people in Germany and in Poland particularly. And so they had just locked up their houses and left and went to England or Spain or America, the ones who could afford it. Now there were just loads and loads of them who could not afford to do that, and they unfortunately had to stay there and wait till later when the Germans would get them and send them to the concentration camps. But the Germans then took over those houses. Any empty house, any Jewish house that had been locked up, or any other house that was not being used, they just took them over and moved their officers in and their soldiers and had a good time. They enjoyed being in Paris, I'm sure. Then they moved back. Renault moved back, part of its plan to France. Her daddy came back. He was not drafted because of his age and because he had 4 children and because he also held an important job at the factory and he was needed. So he worked, he then had to work patrolling the streets, doing air raids and things like that at night. He was civil defense, I think is what it was called. Pretty soon the French government, under Marshal Pétain, and you've probably learned that already anyway, they capitulated, just gave in to the Germans and even helped them to some extent. We're not proud of them. But General de Gaulle and some Free French troops had gone to England and they were still fighting the Germans from there. Well, the majority of the French people were not in agreement with the French government that had moved south and was, helping the Germans, helping them find Jewish people, one thing. And they thought they had good excuses for it, but I don't think so. But anyway, they were tried later on. Pétain was tried by the French government later and punished for what he did. But most of us were just, rooting for de Gaulle's Free French forces. At that time, their symbol was a little cross of Lorraine. It's a little cross with 2 lateral branches. May I just have a piece of chalk 1 second? I'm not ready to be. The little cross looked like this. Instead of just one thing, it had 2 of them. And the Germans had told us, had let it be known that whoever wore one of those, that was a sign that we were against them. So guess what all 15, 16, 17-year-olds wanted to do? They wanted to wear one. They knew it. They knew they could get in trouble if it was seen, but I myself did it too. We had them on a little chain and put them inside of our clothes so they couldn't be seen. But we knew that we were for the Free French forces, and we knew that we were for liberty and freedom. And so that was one of I guess that was our own little small act of protest against the German army that was occupying us, that not only was occupying us, but taking our food, taking our homes, and our lives, unfortunately. Let's see. See, this is embarrassing me, so now I lose track of what I was going to say. Well, then in the meantime, the Germans, that's when they started deciding to just send out the Jewish people were no good. They were just, they weren't good for anything. They were against the Aryan race, the German, blonde and blue-eyed is what you had to be in order to be the right kind of person to be allowed to survive. So they started rounding up the Jews. All the Jewish people had to wear a big yellow star on all their clothes, the Star of David, and so that they would be recognizable on the streets. And then whenever the Germans decided to, they'd round up a bunch of them and send them off on cattle trains to Germany and to concentration camps. One of my very best friend all through high school and later through college had a Jewish daddy. And he went to a concentration camp and he never came back, so did his brother. We had, our family doctor was Jewish. And the whole area where we lived, the whole several blocks, people signed petitions. The Germans, he's a good doctor, let him stay. He's never harmed anybody. Didn't do any good. They took him off too. So it was a sad time to be living. Besides that, we didn't have any food to eat because the German families back home, they had families that were hungry. They were suffering from the war. Their country was being bombed. So naturally, if there was food available, and they had more money than we did because, well, a lot of our people were out of jobs, they just got everything. They and sent it to Germany, sent it to their families. Somebody even thought one time that I might be Jewish. I was waiting for a bus to go to school. This lady came up and she says, "Why don't you wear your star?" I won't tell anybody, But it was kind of scary anyway because, what if she had been a spy for the Germans and really thinking that I was Jewish? And it was sort of scary, but I think maybe she meant well. She really was meaning to, feel sorry for me if I was Jewish and if I did risk being deported. I'll give you time for that. I'm trying to hurry through this year because last year we didn't have much time for questions. Anyway, then before long, America decided to join the war. Well, that was a great hallelujah to start with, because we knew they had powerful bombers, they had, and they were going to help us, and we rejoiced just at that. And of course, they came and dropped a lot of bombs on France, on Paris. But we didn't resent that because we knew it was to help us. And the American bombers always flew by night. I think they were called flying fortresses. They flew by night and dropped bombs, and they usually hit their target. If they were looking for an ammunition train or for an ammunition factory, they hit it. The British planes and the Free French planes, on the other hand, they came by day, and they went, was it the other way around? No, they came by day, but they weren't as accurate. They just, I forget now which ones came by day and which ones came by night, but I do know that this is going to be an awful tape. The British and the Free French bombed, and they did not always hit their target. In fact, one night on March the 3rd, 1942, they hit our house. And there were 3 of us children. My mother was expecting my baby sister. My daddy was out patrolling the streets. And we had to go down in the cellar. And the house caved in on us, but somehow the cellar, they got us back out. Daddy found us. Of course, I'm sure he hurried back to his house to see if it was all right when all those bombs dropped. I know, have you, in movies, at any time, have you ever heard a bomb drop? You've seen war movies. It's like a whistle. You hear that shriek whistling. And then it's underway. And then when you hear it explode, you can breathe again for a minute or two, because if you heard it exploding, it wasn't on top of you. So it's kind of funny. I see some of you are smiling, and I am too, and I'm even laughing. After 50 years or so, doesn't sound as bad anymore, but it is bad. We had a kitty cat. Somehow or another, she didn't make it to the cellar, but she survived. Cats, I guess, are smart, and they get out, and they run. But, from that time until the rest of her life, that cat never, again, would stay anywhere except under a bed. The minute she heard the minute she heard an airplane. The minute she heard an airplane flying overhead, too bad. Well, good thing she didn't live no Fort Worker without the helicopter. She'd spend all of her life under a bed, I guess. But she'd nosedive under the bed and stay there till that airplane was gone. I guess she learned that one time that airplanes mean trouble, so she didn't want any part of that anymore. When our house was bombed, we managed to save a little bit of our furniture and some of the clothes. Everything's not always gone. And the French government then moved us into the suburbs of Paris, into an apartment, a high-rise for that matter, but we were down on the ground floor. We didn't get any money for losing our house because even your insurance policies today say if anything happens because of an act of war, that's it. It's just tough. You don't get anything for it. But we moved into this apartment, and hardships just kept getting worse. Things kept getting harder because the Germans wanted more to send back because they could tell that they were probably losing the war little by little, and so they became meaner and killed more people. A lot of people were in the resistance. My daddy was in the resistance. He didn't do anything violent. He helped people, political prisoners, to escape to southern France. Because he worked for Renault. Most of the people involved worked for Renault as well. And he had a permanent pass to go. You had to have a pass to go between northern France and southern France. And he had a permanent pass to go to both factories, and somehow or another they managed to bribe a lot of German prison guards and French prison guards. And I would sometimes help him. A few times I was sent to the prison to supposedly go see somebody I knew and maybe take him some food or something, when all the time it was really to take him a message that someone would be there at a given time and on a given day to take him and take him on to southern France, and from there they would go to Spain and then maybe to England and to eventually to America. Anyway, they would get free. Now, unfortunately, my family was not able to help any Jewish people. A lot of people did. If I have time, I want to tell you about a little village in France where about 500, well, it was 2 or 3 villages actually, where about 500 French Christians saved the lives of 5,000 Jews, and that's documented. One of the Jewish people who was born there, a man who was born there at that time, wrote a book and made a TV documentary about it, so about those people who saved their lives. But anyway, here we are in an apartment in the suburbs of Paris, practically no food. Electricity was only on certain times of the day. We had a gas stove for cooking, and they only turned the gas on like a little bit at lunch and a little bit at supper time, or maybe some at breakfast to cook. We didn't have an awful lot to cook anyway, so it really didn't matter that much about whether we had a lot of gas or not. It was cold, too. We didn't have any heat. They had central heat, but there wasn't enough coal or whatever, to fuel oil, anything to put heat in the apartment. So we also had a wood stove. And Daddy and all the men in the neighborhood would go out at night and chop down trees, which was against the law. We did a lot of things that were against the law then, but it was the German law, so we didn't feel it was so awful. Chop down trees and sew them up, and and so we could heat the house, and sometimes so we could cook too. The women would go out and the children would go out and gather twigs to start the fire. And I imagine most of you don't drink coffee. Very few of you probably do at your age, do you? But we didn't have any coffee. We had about 1/4 of a pound of coffee per adult per month. And I know if your moms and dads drink coffee, I know Taylor, your daddy likes coffee, and I'm sure he drinks more than 1/4 of a pound of coffee in a day. So you can just imagine what that was like. I'm lucky I found some people I knew today. But we gathered acorns and we roasted them and we ground them up and we called it coffee. It was, the only resemblance to coffee was the color. It was black after you had them roasted and boiled but, you know, can y'all see yourselves doing things like that? You're lucky. We are all so fortunate to live in a country like the United States. We have so much, and also we don't have close neighbors. France is very, very small, and Germany is right next door. You know, all the little countries there just, if they can't depend on each other, if the next country is an enemy, you're in danger, you know, regardless. Yeah, they'd have to go a pretty long way before they'd reach Dothan, Alabama, wouldn't they? And take everything from you. But we just, I guess we just, sometimes we fail to realize how blessed we are to live in a country where there is so much and such an abundance of everything. Bread, we didn't get enough bread, and any self-respecting Frenchman asked Brandy, bread is my favorite food. And when you can't get but a little piece of bread a day, that's very hard. The markets, well, we had a market, we had to hurry. We had an open-air market that was open twice a week. And the foods at the market were not rationed. There were no coupons to buy it. It was free, first come, first served. So Daddy would get up, bless his heart, about 4 o'clock in the morning and be the first, try to be, you know, near the beginning of the line. He usually wasn't the first in line. Reminds me when I come pick the girls up, I have to be here at 2 o'clock to be the first in line for the 3 o'clock exit. But anyway, and then about 6 o'clock, I'd go take his place because he had to get ready to go to work. And for all that waiting and all that standing and all that freezing there, you'd get maybe a handful of potatoes, a head of lettuce, or a bunch of radishes, very, very little food. And the French had never eaten rutabagas before. I love them now. But that was a food we grew for cattle. I'm sorry, I seem to be, I'm right-handed and I look more toward the left. I'm going to start looking over this way. They began to sell rutabaga on the markets and octopus. Anybody ever ate octopus? Well, you know, some people, and I've been up to New England, they love it. I still don't. I didn't like to eat it then, but when you are literally starving, when you're hungry, believe me, you'll eat just almost anything. Didn't like it, but it's hard to imagine that you just simply did not have enough food. If you had all the money in the world, there still wasn't enough food for everybody to eat their fill. So, you know, you pretty much do with what you have, and you're thankful for every little bit. In France, if you're invited for tea or coffee or a meal, which at that time didn't happen much since nobody had much anyway, but if neighbors dropped in or so, they usually, they do today, they bring you a bouquet of flowers or maybe some pastry or something. Well, flowers sometimes you could get, but since people had so little money anyway, and they knew that the friends they were going to visit probably, well, they were as bad off as they were, they didn't have any food. So sometimes people would take their monthly coffee ration and bring it as a gift, you know, or maybe they had squirreled away a jar of mustard 2 or 3 years ago, and they'd bring that, and you were just as pleased as punch when somebody could bring you something like that. About this time, I guess I'm overstepping things, but Mother had to go to the hospital to have my baby sister. Well, she was so sick, they kept her for a whole month. And we went to bed. While she was in the hospital, she was able to get up. You know, she wasn't bedridden all the time. But she didn't get enough food even in the hospital. She volunteered to work in the kitchen, in the hospital kitchen, washing dishes. They didn't have dishwashers then. She had to work in the kitchen just so, because she could get an extra little piece of food. Maybe if they had a slice of bread left over, they'd give it to the people who volunteered to work for her. And I'll never forget one time Daddy and my brother and my older sister and my other sister and I, went to see Mother in the hospital, and here we're bringing her a little bouquet of flowers, and she just cried and cried. And I thought, well, now she's not that emotional over a bouquet of flowers. She's had some before. And when it got down to the truth of the matter is, she was thinking, she told us later, she says, well, I would have really wanted you brought me a sandwich if you could have. And that's sad when you think that your mama is in the hospital and not getting enough food. But that's the way it was. And again, France had a lot of food. Of course, the Germans would go to Normandy where we grow all of our butter, where all the cattle is, the dairy cattle, and where a lot of the vegetables are grown and produce that usually is shipped to Paris. Well, the Germans would buy it on the spot, and it never made its way to Paris. And if it did make its way to Paris, then they had more money they could buy. And a lot of French people were dishonest. They made a profit. They would sell it on what we call the black market. They'd sell it because the Germans could pay more for them than we could. Well, they just sell it to them. That's why we didn't have any food. It's not that there was an actual lack of food. Of course, some of the things like coffee that had to be imported, naturally, there weren't any boats or airplanes bringing stuff like that to France that we can't do. We can understand why those things weren't there. I was thinking in here, but I was talking a while ago about the resistance groups in France. Now, some of them were a lot more violent than we were, and that's fine. I mean, I didn't have a problem with them, but they blew up ammunition trains, they blew up factories. But you know how the Germans retaliated? When someone, like, if a German officer was killed because some resistance, usually it was when the French, would kill them through blowing up a train or a building or something that they knew. They would go out and rope off a street. They'd take Main Street in Dauphine and put a cordon here and run it another, maybe 5 or 6 blocks down, and anybody that was caught on that street would be either sent to a concentration camp, and sometimes they would be shot on the spot right there. They were innocent people, but they were paying an eye for an eye. They were paying for the Germans that had been killed, So you had to be careful to stay home, because we had curfews. At night we didn't go out. At night everything had to be blacked out. The houses, we had deep drapes or shades on the windows, and if they could see one little bit of light from the outside, the policemen or the German troops, the Germans were forever. They were actually policing the city. And if they saw one little bit of light, well, you could be in prison just for that. But again, we didn't have electricity an awful lot, but we had those little votive candles, the little small candles, and if we had them, if you could find them, we'd have little containers. People still put them in little containers now, but we had water in them and maybe a drop of oil on top, and those candles would then float, and they wouldn't melt as fast. And we'd set them in front of a mirror because that gave you double the light. So you didn't do an awful lot of reading at night, did we? And another thing we did at night is listen to the BBC, British Broadcasting Corporation. There we would get news. We would really know what was going on in the world, because the French radio could only tell what the Germans would let them. Like if the Germans had lost a plane or something had been shot down, they weren't about to tell the French civilians about it, so they made everything sound in their favor. But it was forbidden to listen to the BBC and the Free French radio, and if you caught at that, you could be thrown in prison, but everybody did it anyway. We had to know what was going on. But people have a tendency to do the things that they're not supposed to do a lot of times, don't they? But, I can excuse those things. I'm not apologizing for it, because here we were just downtrodden by the German army and robbed of our food, robbed of our homes, and our families were killed. So why shouldn't we disobey them and listen to the BBC? And I'm getting near the end. Maybe we'll have time for a few questions today. because the radio, the Germans also made sure, have you seen when your TV sets are scrambled and you can't see the picture? Well, they did the same thing to the radio. Many times we could barely hear what they were saying, but it was good just to hear friendly voices once in a while, to know somebody out there cared about you, you know? And the Germans, when the Americans landed in Normandy and fought their way toward Paris, of course, it was great rejoicing. We almost didn't care. Would you believe when the Americans would come and bomb, and I guess they did have it wrong, the Americans would bomb during the day and the British at night. But we would actually go on the rooftops and watch the bombers fly over and cheer them. Because they didn't know we were cheering them. But we felt so good about it because we knew they were coming to help us and to set us free. Just before the Germans had to leave Paris, before the American troops and the French troops took over Paris, I think the Americans were very kind. They let General de Gaulle come into Paris first. And then, you know, they came just about the same time, but they sort of let him liberate Paris, even though the American troops had really done most of the work, I would think, because they had more equipment and there were more people and so forth. But anyway, we watched from our house an American reconnaissance plane being shot down by the anti-aircraft guns by the Germans. That was when the liberated troops were just outside of Paris, just real close. And they shot, and one man parachuted, an American pilot parachuted, and they shot him in midair. They just went right on shooting. That's against international law. And but the French people in the area, there were still Germans, a lot of them around, but they were sort of on the run too by that time, you know, but there was still a lot of them around. We all just went, I would say hundreds of people just went and buried that man and just piled flowers on that grave, you know, and the Germans didn't do anything. They knew they were lost. They knew that I think the people at that time would have attacked them with their bare hands if they had tried to stop them from, you know, from what they were doing. So, there's just one other small side to this. The apartment where we were moved during the war had a big forest just behind it, and on the other end of the forest, the Germans had a military camp, so to speak, but for young people, young boys your age. The Germans, they had, well, I don't think the boys were volunteers, they were just taken, most of them, but they had to serve in the junior SS troops. And about the time that the Germans left the area where we lived, when they, two of those little boys, I'd forgotten that part last year, two of those little boys, they were 14 and 15 years old, came running out of those woods, scared to death, shaking, crying. Somehow the rest of them had left, and they had gotten left behind. And we fed them. Thank God that, you know, people can have, of course we had to turn them over, but we fed them first, that people can have compassion even on the enemies. And just think, just try to imagine yourselves being drafted at your age and having to go and fight people. That's it. Any questions? No questions?
Tell them about, didn't you tell us last year about growing vegetables on your windowsill?
Oh, yeah, we did that when we lived in different, yeah. I redid my notes this year, and I remembered more, and I forgot some. But when we moved into the apartment, we had a big balcony and had a flower box in the balcony. We didn't grow flowers, we grew tomatoes or lettuce, or, you know, things that you could eat. Flowers was a luxury, and we were hungry. Everybody was hungry. Right? I used to, later on, I used to tell my children, they were all pretty picky about what they wanted to eat, you know. And my youngest son would often come in and say, Mother, I'm starved. What's for supper? And that's, if you have to ask, you're not hungry. Because if you're really, really hungry, you don't have to ask what it is. You'll eat it. Because, well, for one thing, he knew it was good. Anyway, we had food. we never asked what's for a meal. We were just glad to get a meal. My baby sister, well, she was born in 42, just not too long after we were born. That child never saw or tasted an orange or orange juice till she was about 3 years old. Because there weren't any. Because we don't grow oranges in France. And if we had, the Germans would probably send them to Germany anyway. But you couldn't buy it. The only thing you could get is if you knew people sometimes who were, who had maybe fruit trees and the Germans didn't get there first. Otherwise, it was very, very, very hungry, very afraid, very demeaned, very just humiliated. There are things that you just can't forget, and there are things that you really cannot imagine. I'm sure you've seen movies, you've heard about the Jewish people in the concentration camps, you might have even seen some of it, but it's still a long way off when you haven't been there. So, thank you.
I want you to tell them something else. Remember when you got married and you came to this country and your mother-in-law one day was talking about, tell them all that.
I forgot. When I first married his granddaddy in Tunica's, and it was in 1946, and I came to this country, and my mother-in-law she was telling me all about the war. She had lived in Alabama all through it. There wasn't really a war here. And I'm very thankful that the American troops went and helped us. But she said, oh, we just suffered so much. She said we could only get a pound of coffee a week or something like that, and only a pound of butter at a time is all you could buy, and we only had 5 pounds of sugar a month, and she had just complained and complained. Here we didn't even come close to having that sort of stuff. And sugar was unheard of, butter was unheard of. We had a little bit of margarine sometimes. And, another thing I forgot to tell you, when Mother came home from the hospital finally, we noticed, and I was the oldest child, so I began to realize, well, Mother won't even eat that 1 egg a week that she's entitled to, that we got, or she wouldn't eat this, or she wouldn't eat that. Well, I don't like it. I can't stand eggs. I don't like butter. I don't like cheese. I don't. Then when the war was over and you could buy all you wanted to, suddenly she liked them again. So, we realized, I think even then I probably knew that many, many, many parents made sacrifices. The reason she supposedly didn't like those things is because she left them for the children, or maybe she left some for her husband who had to go to work every day and she was not working. There's a great beauty to the fact that people do sacrifice for other people if they're loving people, if they're Christians. And but why? I don't know. I don't know why the Germans were like that. All German people were bad. I'm sure there were just hundreds and hundreds of German people who did not, agree with Hitler. I think the man was just absolutely crazy. And but the people in Germany, they pretty much didn't have a choice. They either went the way he wanted them to go, or they would probably wind up I've wondered sometimes. Sometimes I've wondered the German people who worked in those concentration camps, who they actually herded children and women into gas chambers and gassed them to death. Or some of them they worked them to death, some of them they shot to death. I've often wondered myself, would I, this is my job, but would I be able to do that job, or would I say, well, they'll just have to kill me, but I'm not going to do that? What do you think? What do y'all think? Taylor, do you think you could have done that? I'm talking to Taylor because I know him, so it's easy to pick on him, I know him. Could you have done it if that had been your job?
I don't think so.
I don't think I could have either. And I think if enough German people had refused to do that job, it would have ended sooner, But I don't know. My daddy, after the concentration camps were freed and empty. My daddy worked on the French border in Strasbourg. He worked, and I helped him there too. I was about 18 by then, or 19. Helped him. They were repatriating those people. They're bringing them home to France, the ones from the concentration. And they looked like living, walking skeletons. And absolutely. The ones who survived, which they were lucky they had their lives at least. But we had a food center set up, and we were feeding them. And you had to give them little portions, like for a bird, because their system just could not take it. It would make them sick to try to eat a regular meal. We just, they had to just, we bathed them, deloused them. They all had lice and whatever else from the concentration camps, and just would feed them a little bit each day until they could get enough strength back to go back to their homes where they belong. But to get back to my mother-in-law, another thing, when she opened a loaf of bread, the heel of the bread, the first piece, which is my favorite, but the first piece automatically went in the trash can. And I have cried many a time. I thought, oh, just think how much people would have enjoyed just having that, that bread. And I throw away just as much as anybody else, but before I throw it away, I save it for a week or so and see if I won't eat it again later. Because I can still remember that waste is, literally sinful when there are other people that are hungry and would love to have what we waste. I'm really through this time.
I really have one more question.
Okay.
Now, one more time.
Of course,
I've forgotten this one. How did you meet their granddaddy now?
How did I meet their granddaddy?
You
He was in military, and
But
during
you went
the war.
back up to Strasbourg and worked up there with your dad, and you didn't know
Yeah.
him then.
No, but we went back to Paris, and I met him in Paris. The USO they threw a party for local people, and I went and I met him.
He was one of the occupying troops.
He was he was actually just temporarily through Paris at that time and came back later. I think the reason he liked me is because he could speak to me and I could understand him.
Did you speak English
Oh
then?
yeah, I'd taken it for about, I hate to even admit this, but I took about 7 years in school of English and about 8 years of German. When you go to school in France, in high school, you just about have to have at least one modern foreign language and one dead language, Latin or Greek or any combination too, of each kind. But it's necessary there because, again, you can travel 300 miles and you're in a different country. You have to be able to speak another language, so.
So how many languages do you speak? French,
Just-
German, English, and a dead language?
Well, don't speak to that much, but I did take some Latin and some Greek, and I took 2 years of Spanish in night class just for the fun of it. I guess I knew then I like languages. Hate to tell you this, but I hated my history teacher, and I
Oh.
never learned anything in history.
Do y'all have any
But not
questions?
just enough to get by.
You've got enough history inside you now. Do y'all have any questions? Okay, it's time for